A family is never truly divided by money. It is divided the moment someone believes they deserve more than everyone else. That sentence echoed through my mind as I stared at the thick, cream-colored envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. My late wife's handwriting was still visible across the front, unchanged despite the passing years. Thomas had called only an hour earlier. He said the final version of her will was ready to be presented exactly as she had instructed on this particular evening, with every member of the Harrison family sitting together beneath the same roof. I thanked him without asking another question because deep inside I already understood what tonight would become. The long driveway leading to Harrison Estate appeared as familiar as it had for decades, lined with towering oak trees that had witnessed birthdays, weddings, holidays, and countless family dinners. From the outside, the mansion still represented stability, success, and tradition. Inside, however, I feared something much older had quietly taken root. My wife used to tell me that greed rarely announces itself with raised voices. It arrives wearing perfect manners, polished smiles, and carefully chosen words. I stepped through the front doors carrying the envelope beneath my arm. James greeted me with his usual quiet dignity before taking my coat. His eyes briefly settled on the envelope, then returned to mine. He did not ask what it contained. After serving this family for more than 30 years, James understood that some evenings carried their own answers before anyone spoke. The dining room glowed beneath the crystal chandelier as candles reflected across polished silver and the long oak table. Isabel stood beside David pouring wine with effortless confidence while discussing future plans for the estate as though every important decision had already been settled. David listened more than he spoke, his tired expression suggesting responsibilities had begun to outweigh ambition. Ethan lingered near the grand staircase, studying everyone instead of joining the conversation. He had inherited the rare ability to notice what other people overlooked. Eleanor remained, seated beneath the chandelier with her hands folded quietly in her lap, avoiding my eyes in a way I had seen only a handful of times throughout our lives. One empty chair remained beside the fireplace, reserved for Thomas. Its presence alone changed the atmosphere inside the room. I slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of my jacket before taking my place at the far end of the table. No one noticed except Ethan. For a brief second our eyes met before he returned his attention to the others. Everyone believed they were about to witness the reading of a will. None of them realized they were actually about to discover which relationships inside this family had been built upon love and which had quietly been built upon expectation. No one reached for the food after I sat down. The candles continued burning quietly, filling the dining room with warm light that somehow made the silence feel even heavier. Every portrait hanging along the walls seemed to watch us as though generations of the Harrison family had gathered to witness whatever was about to happen. Isabel gently placed the wine bottle back onto the polished sideboard before returning to her seat beside David. She smiled with practiced elegance and began discussing future improvements to the estate, mentioning renovations, charitable events, and long-term investment plans with the confidence of someone who believed tomorrow already belonged to her. David nodded politely, adding only an occasional comment. The pressure in his face had become impossible to ignore. He looked like a man carrying responsibilities that no longer fit comfortably upon his shoulders. Ethan quietly left the staircase and took his place halfway down the table. Unlike the others, he never hurried to speak. Instead, he watched each conversation unfold with careful attention, studying expressions instead of words. Eleanor unfolded her linen napkin with slow, deliberate movements, keeping her eyes fixed upon the polished oak table rather than anyone seated around it. I had known Eleanor long enough to recognize that silence. It was the silence of someone remembering promises made years earlier. James entered carrying the first course with the same calm precision he had demonstrated throughout 3 decades of service. As he placed my plate before me, his eyes briefly met mine before drifting toward the inside pocket of my jacket where the envelope remained hidden. He gave the slightest respectful nod without speaking. Sometimes loyalty requires nothing more than understanding exactly when to remain silent. Isabel eventually turned toward me with an expression that appeared both respectful and carefully prepared. She suggested that since everyone had gathered together, perhaps it would be an appropriate evening to discuss the future leadership of the Harrison estate. Her words sounded generous, yet I recognized the expectation quietly waiting beneath every sentence. Before I could answer, the deep sound of the front door echoed through the entrance hall. The conversation immediately stopped. Measured footsteps crossed the marble floor with familiar confidence before Thomas appeared in the dining room, carrying his weathered leather briefcase. He greeted everyone warmly, shook James's hand, and quietly took the empty chair beside the fireplace. The atmosphere changed the instant he sat down. Even Isabel's confident smile faded for only a moment. Thomas rested one hand upon the briefcase without opening it. He looked toward me, waiting patiently for instruction. Around the table, everyone believed the evening was about to become a routine legal discussion concerning inheritance. None of them realized that before the first page of the will was ever read, each person would unknowingly reveal far more about themselves than any legal document ever could. Thomas rested the weathered leather briefcase beside his chair without opening it immediately. Instead, he accepted the cup of coffee James quietly placed before him and looked around the table with the calm expression of a man who understood that legal documents often carried far greater emotional weight than financial value. No one resumed eating. Even the silverware remained untouched beside carefully prepared meals that had suddenly become unimportant. Isabel finally broke the silence by asking whether the reading of the will would require everyone's presence. Her tone sounded polite, but the question arrived too quickly to be casual. Thomas smiled respectfully and answered that my late wife's instructions had been unusually specific. Every immediate family member was required to remain in the room from the beginning until the final page had been read. Ethan quietly glanced toward me before studying Thomas again. He recognized that something about tonight differed from every family meeting he had attended before. David shifted slightly in his chair, rubbing his hands together beneath the table as though trying to settle thoughts he could not organize. Eleanor remained motionless beneath the crystal chandelier, her attention fixed upon the polished oak surface instead of the faces surrounding her. I slowly reached into my jacket and removed the cream-colored envelope before placing it in the exact center of the table. Every conversation stopped immediately. No one reached toward it. No one even looked away. Thomas acknowledged the envelope with a slight nod before speaking again. He explained that the document inside had remained sealed exactly as my late wife requested, and that neither he nor anyone else had altered a single word since the day she signed it. James quietly walked toward the massive double doors leading into the dining room. Without announcing his intentions, he gently closed both doors before returning to his place beside the wall. The soft sound of the locks engaging echoed through the room. Isabel looked surprised for only a moment before asking whether that was truly necessary. I answered calmly that no one was being prevented from leaving. The closed doors simply represented respect for the seriousness of the evening. Thomas then opened his briefcase and carefully arranged several legal folders beside his plate. He did not begin reading. Instead, he looked directly at me and asked whether I wished to present the envelope before the will itself. I answered yes without hesitation. My wife had once told me that people reveal their true priorities long before important decisions are made. They reveal them the instant they believe something valuable may soon belong to someone else. As I slowly slid the envelope across the polished oak table toward Thomas, I realized that before a single clause of the will was ever spoken aloud, every person seated around me had already begun showing exactly who they truly were. As Thomas rested his hand upon the unopened envelope, my thoughts drifted backward to a quiet autumn afternoon nearly 15 years earlier, when my wife and I sat together inside the dark library overlooking the lake behind Harrison Estate. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while stacks of legal documents covered the long wooden desk between us. We had not gathered there to divide wealth. We had gathered because we had begun noticing something far more troubling than disagreements over money. Small acts of kindness were becoming increasingly rare, while conversations about ownership, control, and future inheritance seemed to appear at every family gathering. My wife carefully closed one folder before looking directly at me. She said that fortunes do not destroy families. Expectations do. At first I believed she was worrying too much. Every family experiences disagreements, especially one responsible for preserving generations of history. She quietly smiled and asked me to remember the previous Thanksgiving dinner. Instead of recalling the celebration itself, I I remembered people discussing properties, investments, and future leadership before dessert had even been served. The following Christmas felt much the same. Birthdays slowly transformed into opportunities to speculate about the estate rather than celebrate one another. None of the conversations sounded openly selfish, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. My wife suggested something unexpected. Rather than writing an ordinary will, she wanted to create one capable of revealing character instead of simply transferring property. She believed that true inheritance should never reward the loudest voice or the strongest ambition. It should quietly identify the person who valued family above personal gain. Thomas had joined us several weeks later inside that same library. After listening carefully, he admitted he had never been asked to draft a will designed as both a legal document and a moral examination. My wife insisted that every clause should encourage patience, honesty, and responsibility rather than competition. If someone became disappointed by the document, the disappointment itself might reveal far more than any courtroom ever could. I eventually agreed because I trusted her judgment more than my own. Over the following months, we carefully revised every page together, never once discussing who deserved the largest share. Instead, we asked a different question. Who would still choose this family if there were nothing left to inherit? Remembering those evenings now, I looked around the dining room and realized my wife had predicted this moment with remarkable accuracy. She knew the will would never create division by itself. It would simply shine light upon divisions that had quietly existed for years. Thomas gently rested his fingertips against the sealed envelope before looking toward me once again. I gave him a slow nod, understanding that the years of preparation had finally reached the moment my wife had envisioned long before any of us recognized how necessary her final lesson would become. Thomas slowly opened the cream-colored envelope with extraordinary care, unfolding the first pages of my late wife's final will before placing them neatly upon the polished oak table. The sound of paper brushing against wood seemed louder than anyone breathing inside the room. Isabel leaned forward almost instinctively before quickly correcting her posture. David folded his hands together beneath the table. Ethan never looked away from the documents. Eleanor quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment, while James remained respectfully beside the doorway, his expression unchanged. Thomas cleared his throat and began reading the opening statement exactly as it had been written years earlier. My wife did not begin by listing assets, investments, or properties. Instead, she addressed each of us personally. She wrote that a family's greatest inheritance was never measured in dollars, acres, or historic estates. It was measured by the willingness to protect one another even when personal. Sacrifice became necessary. The room remained perfectly silent. Then Thomas reached the first legal clause. Harrison Estate, every investment account, every charitable trust, and every historic property would remain temporarily under the administration of the Harrison Foundation until every condition written inside the will had been satisfied. Isabel's confident expression faded almost immediately. That was clearly not what she had expected to hear. Thomas continued reading without changing his calm pace. No individual family member would receive permanent control over any major family asset simply because of birth order, marriage, or expectation. Leadership would instead be determined only after every beneficiary demonstrated a consistent commitment to preserving the family's integrity above personal ambition. David slowly looked toward me with visible confusion. Ethan quietly studied every sentence as though assembling pieces of a much larger puzzle. Eleanor lowered her gaze once again, yet this time I sensed relief rather than fear. She already understood the purpose behind those carefully written words. Isabel finally asked whether the will specified exactly how those qualities would be evaluated. Thomas answered that the following clauses would explain everything in precise legal language. No one interrupted him again. He carefully turned the page and revealed another series of conditions. Years of documented service to the Harrison Foundation, acts of personal responsibility, honesty during legal disclosures, and demonstrated loyalty to family commitments would all become measurable factors before any final distribution could ever occur. My wife had transformed a legal document into something far greater than anyone around the table had anticipated. It was no longer simply a will. It had become a mirror reflecting the values of every person sitting before it. As Thomas reached for the next page containing the first individual beneficiary provisions, I realized that the true conflict inside this room had only just begun, because each new clause would quietly force someone to confront the difference between the life they believed they deserved and the character they had actually demonstrated. Thomas carefully turned to the next section of the will and paused long enough for every person at the table to understand that what followed would not concern property alone. His steady voice filled the dining room as he explained that the remaining clauses described responsibilities rather than rewards. My late wife believed that inheritance should never become a prize for simply belonging to the family. It should become the consequence of years spent protecting it. The first provision addressed David. Rather than granting him immediate authority over the Harrison Foundation, the will required that he complete 3 years of transparent leadership under independent legal oversight, while working alongside the board instead of above it. Thomas explained that the purpose was never to question David's abilities. It was to ensure that leadership remained accountable to principles rather than personality. David looked down quietly, absorbing every word without protest. Isabel immediately asked whether those requirements could be amended through a unanimous family agreement. Thomas answered politely that they could not. My wife had written each condition to remain legally binding regardless of future family pressure. Isabel leaned back in her chair, saying nothing more, yet the disappointment in her expression became impossible to hide. The next provision concerned the historic Harrison estate itself. No beneficiary would ever possess the legal authority to sell the mansion, divide the surrounding land, or remove irreplaceable family archives for personal financial benefit. The estate would remain permanently protected under the foundation so future generations could inherit not merely buildings, but a complete history. Ethan quietly smiled for the first time that evening. I suspected he understood something the others had not yet realized. My wife had spent years protecting memories rather than money. Eleanor finally raised her eyes toward Thomas, listening with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. James remained respectfully beside the doorway, although I noticed the faintest sign of relief crossing his face. He had served this family long enough to know how easily valuable traditions disappear when measured only in dollars. Thomas continued reading. Every beneficiary would also be evaluated through written records of charitable service, professional integrity, honesty during legal proceedings, and willingness to place family unity ahead of personal advantage whenever conflict arose. Silence settled across the room once again. No one objected because every condition reflected values we had all claimed to admire for years. The difference was that those values had now become legally significant. I slowly looked around the table and recognized what my wife had quietly accomplished. The will was revealing character without accusing anyone directly. Every reaction unfolding before me had appeared naturally, exactly as she predicted long ago. As Thomas reached for another sealed document attached behind the legal clauses, he quietly explained that the next pages contained a private statement written entirely in my wife's own hand, intended to explain why she believed these unusual conditions were absolutely necessary. Thomas carefully unfolded the handwritten letter that had remained sealed behind the legal provisions for so many years. Before reading the first sentence, he looked toward me as though asking one final time whether I wished to continue. I answered with a quiet nod. My late wife had written those pages knowing she would never be present to explain them herself, yet somehow I could almost hear her voice filling the dining room once again. Thomas began reading slowly. She wrote that if everyone was hearing these words together, then the family had reached the moment she had anticipated for many years. She explained that she never feared disagreements over money because those could eventually be resolved. What frightened her was watching people slowly measure one another according to future inheritance instead of present character. She admitted that she had noticed subtle changes long before anyone else acknowledged them. Family gatherings became discussions about ownership. Acts of generosity were sometimes followed by quiet expectations. Even ordinary kindness occasionally arrived carrying invisible conditions. She refused to allow the next generation to mistake those habits for love. Every sentence settled heavily across the room. Isabel lowered her eyes toward the table. David remained completely still. Ethan listened with extraordinary concentration, absorbing every word as though discovering a side of his grandmother he had never fully understood. Eleanor quietly brushed away a tear without attempting to hide it. She had known many of these thoughts years earlier, yet hearing them spoken aloud made the burden of silence finally begin to disappear. The letter continued. My wife explained that the unusual conditions inside the will were never intended to punish anyone. They existed because true character only becomes visible when personal expectations collide with disappointment. A family built only upon comfortable circumstances remains untested. A family willing to remain united after expectations are challenged becomes truly unbreakable. James quietly lowered his head in silent respect while Thomas continued reading. My wife thanked him by name for protecting the dignity of the Harrison household through decades of faithful service, reminding everyone that loyalty often comes from those expecting nothing in return. Then she addressed Ethan directly. She encouraged him to continue asking honest questions throughout his life, because families become stronger when younger generations seek understanding instead of repeating comfortable assumptions. Ethan looked down quietly, visibly moved by words written years before he became old enough to appreciate their meaning. When Thomas reached the final paragraph, my wife left us with one simple request. She asked that no one measure the success of the evening by who inherited the largest portion of the estate. Instead, she hoped each person would leave the dining room asking whether they had become the kind of individual worthy of preserving a family's future. As Thomas carefully folded the letter and returned it to the table, I realized no legal clause had changed the atmosphere inside Harrison House as profoundly as the quiet wisdom contained within those handwritten pages. Yet one final decision still remained before the true purpose of the will would finally become clear. The silence that followed the final sentence of my wife's letter felt heavier than anything Thomas had read from the will itself. No one immediately spoke. The crystal chandelier continued casting warm light across the polished oak table, while every person remained lost inside private thoughts they could no longer ignore. I slowly looked around the room before finally breaking the silence. I admitted that I had known every word inside that letter for many years. My wife had asked me to protect it until the family reached the point where truth would matter more than expectation. That evening had finally arrived. Isabel quietly asked why neither of us had trusted the family enough to explain our concerns while she was still alive. I answered gently that trust had never been the issue. Timing had been. My wife believed people rarely recognize the weight of important lessons until they are forced to examine themselves instead of judging everyone else. Thomas quietly nodded before removing one final legal attachment from beneath the will. He explained that this document contained my wife's personal explanation of how the conditions had already been observed over many years. The requirements inside the will had never been random. They reflected choices every beneficiary had already made throughout ordinary family life. David looked genuinely surprised. Thomas calmly explained that acts of generosity, professional honesty, respect for family commitments, charitable involvement, and willingness to accept responsibility had all been documented long before anyone knew they were being considered. My wife never created a competition. She simply paid attention to everyday character. Ethan slowly smiled as understanding settled across his face. He realized that inheritance had never depended upon a single evening or a dramatic decision. It had quietly been shaped by years of ordinary choices. Eleanor finally lifted her eyes toward me and softly admitted that she now understood why my wife had remained so patient even when disagreements became difficult. She had been watching people grow instead of reacting to isolated moments. James quietly placed a small wooden journal beside Thomas. Inside were decades of handwritten observations prepared by my wife herself. None of them criticized anyone. Instead, they recorded simple moments of kindness, honesty, responsibility, forgiveness, and humility that often passed unnoticed by everyone else. Isabel carefully looked toward the journal before lowering her gaze once more. Her expression no longer reflected disappointment. It reflected reflection. The atmosphere inside the dining room had changed completely. Earlier that evening, everyone expected a legal distribution of wealth. Now they understood they had been participating in a lesson about character that had begun many years before the will was ever signed. I quietly stood from my chair and walked toward the fireplace before turning back toward the family. I explained that only one final decision remained, and unlike everything Thomas had read so far, this last decision would not determine who received the greatest inheritance. It would determine whether the Harrison family had truly learned the lesson my wife had spent the final years of her life trying to leave behind. I slowly returned to my chair and looked at every face gathered around the long oak table, realizing that the room no longer felt divided by expectation. It felt united by reflection. Thomas closed the will with deliberate care before placing both hands upon the polished cover. He announced that every legal condition had now been presented exactly as my late wife intended, and that only one formal declaration remained. He explained that the Harrison Foundation, the estate, and every historic family asset would continue under the structure already established inside the will. No individual would receive absolute control. Leadership would always belong to those who consistently demonstrated integrity, humility, accountability, and devotion to the family's long-term future rather than personal ambition. David quietly stood and admitted that he had entered the evening believing responsibility automatically followed inheritance. Now he understood that responsibility must always come first. Isabel slowly looked around the room before offering something I had not expected. She acknowledged that she had spent years planning how to preserve the Harrison legacy without fully understanding what that legacy truly represented. Wealth had become easier to measure than character. She accepted that my wife's final lesson had been directed toward everyone equally, including herself. Eleanor smiled through quiet tears, her shoulders finally relaxing after carrying silent knowledge for so many years. James carefully collected the handwritten journal, the letter, and every legal document before placing them back inside the weathered leather briefcase. He handled each page with the same respect he had shown this family throughout decades of faithful service. Ethan remained standing beside the table, studying the portraits that covered the dining room walls. He softly observed that every generation leaves behind two inheritances. One consists of buildings, land, investments, and treasured possessions. The other consists of values that quietly shape every decision made by those who follow. The first inheritance eventually changes hands. The second determines whether a family deserves to endure. Thomas smiled gently, saying my late wife would have appreciated those words. Morning light slowly began filtering through the tall windows, replacing candlelight with the first quiet brightness of a new day. The mansion looked exactly as it had when the evening began, yet everything inside it had changed. No voices had been raised. No courtroom battle had taken place. No fortune had been dramatically handed from one person to another. Instead, a carefully written will had accomplished something far more important. It revealed that families are not preserved by documents alone, but by the character of the people trusted to honor them. I looked once more toward the empty chair where my wife had always sat and silently thanked her for understanding something I had learned only tonight. A lasting legacy is never built by deciding who receives the greatest share. It is built by teaching every generation that the greatest inheritance they will ever leave behind is the kind of people they choose to become.